Calgary, Rocky Ridge.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to speak to you today, or to speak to the Chamber today, about Bill C-8, an act to implement certain measures included in the fall economic and fiscal update. This debate comes amid a real crisis of leadership in Canada. The Prime Minister, we know he called a summer election that Canadians didn't want, and by cleverly sowing enough division and fear in just the right places, he managed to squeak out another minority government with the same willing partners in the Bloc and the NDP. He claimed that the 2021 election was necessary because we were at the most transformational moment since 1945, and that he would need a new mandate to implement a bold new agenda befitting a grand historical moment. So once elected, with the same partners that were already giving his government a free hand to do anything he wanted, what did the Prime Minister do that was so transformational that it required an election and a fresh mandate? Well, he did absolutely nothing. He waited weeks before making a few tweaks to his cabinet. Then he waited a few more weeks before finally reconvening Parliament, delivered a bland, recycled speech from the throne, and eventually, the week before Christmas, he tabled what they were still referring to as the fall economic statement. So what was in this much-delayed update? What were the once-in-a-lifetime transformational programs that required a new mandate from an election to implement? Well, Mr. Speaker, absolutely nothing. The statement was a continuation of the same trajectory that this government has been on both since and before the COVID crisis began. The fall economic statement shows that this government is continuing down the path that it has long walked, with out-of-control spending, higher taxes, continuing inflation, which threatens to trigger a spiral of higher prices for consumers, higher interest rates, higher mortgage payments for consumers, and higher debt service costs for governments, which will eventually mean higher taxes and service program cuts. This is the trajectory that we are now on, and it began long before COVID. Canadians are facing an affordability crisis. Inflation is the highest that it has been in decades. Families can expect their grocery costs to increase by $1,000 this year. For millions of Canadians, this means hard choices about what they will do without. The vast majority of Canadians do not have an extra $1,000 a year to spend on groceries. Before the pandemic, nearly half of Canadians were virtually broke after paying all of their monthly obligations, and they simply can't absorb higher food costs. And there's the cost of home heating. This is an absolute life necessity in Canada. Nobody in Canada, not even on the West Coast, can simply tough it out in the winter and just put on a sweater when it gets cold. When it does get cold, and it gets bitterly cold in every part of Canada, Canadians need reliable and affordable energy to heat their homes. And this government has slapped an ever-increasing carbon tax on the home heating costs for millions of Canadians. Transportation is also more expensive. Gasoline is more expensive. And this is also due in part to the carbon tax. This cost affects everyone, whether they own a car or not, whether they drive or take the bus. It makes driving to work more expensive, and it also makes bus passes more expensive. And it puts pressure on municipalities that have increasing costs to operate police, fire, ambulance, waste collection, and transit vehicles. These higher costs have resulted in higher property taxes or cuts in services, and will continue to do so. Nowhere is the increased cost of living and inflation crisis more obvious than in Canada's housing markets. A true crisis in affordable rent and home ownership has deeply taken root in Canada under this government. It's much worse. It became much worse during the COVID crisis itself. And this bill does not give hope to would-be home buyers or renters. In fact, it's a continuation of the very policies that have pushed home ownership out of reach for young families. COVID has had a devastating effect on the Canadian economy. It resulted in a significant drop in GDP and massive job losses. And yet the price of residential real estate went up. And not just by a little bit. The Canadian real estate market saw the most spectacular run-up in home prices ever seen. The average price of a Canadian home went up 30% in the middle of an economic contraction with massive job losses. How could that possibly happen? Was there a massive collapse in other asset classes to offset a rush of money into residential real estate? No. Stock markets also enjoyed a spectacular run during COVID. So where did the money come from? Well, Mr. Speaker, can there now be no doubt that massive deficits, facilitated and enabled by central banks that massively expand the money supply by buying the government's debt with newly created money, inflate the value of assets without actually creating any real wealth? Just inflation. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill, with its deficits, absence of credible fiscal anchors, or acknowledgement of the inflation crisis, is a doubling down on the previous fall economic statement and last year's budget. There is nothing to give Canadians the hope for a future where there will be affordable homes, manageable costs for basic necessities, relief from taxes, or better public services that they want and need. There's nothing in this statement to give Canadians confidence that their leaders are prudent managers of the nation's finances. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the Parliamentary Budget Officer has pointed out that the government's own stated rationale for the billions in additional spending contained in the update no longer exist. The PBO has also pointed out that since the pandemic began, billions of dollars have gone into non-COVID new spending programs. And furthermore, beyond the dollars and cents, the PBO has pointed out that this government is struggling with basic fiscal transparency. From the PBO, quote, "This year, both the annual financial report and the public accounts were published on December 14th, 2021, the latest publication since 1993-94. Comparatively, Canada was the last among the G7 countries to publish their financial accounts for the 2020-2021 fiscal year," unquote. It goes on to point out that the federal public accounts are published later than most provincial and territorial public accounts, and that, quote, "Canada falls short of the standard for advanced practice in the International Monetary Fund fiscal reporting guidelines," unquote. In some respects, Mr. Speaker, these quotes from the PBO about basic competence and transparency might be the most disturbing part of all. For 6 years, this government is increasingly paralyzing the country with incompetence. We watched a government just shrug off payment systems that don't pay, procurement systems that don't procure. They create regulatory systems designed to kill projects. They've dithered for years with a non-decision on Huawei, jeopardizing national cybersecurity. They defy parliamentary orders. They've presided over the resignation of 8 generals, 1 clerk of the Privy Council, a governor general. And now we're adding the inability to file timely fiscal reports to the incredible litany of muddled and incompetent government.
2 minutes.
Today, as we debate the implementing legislation for the fall economic statement, Canada is as divided as it has ever been. This government has long pitted East versus West, urban versus rural, now the vaccinated against the unvaccinated. They operate under an us versus them mentality that has finally and courageously been called out by one of their own this week. So to conclude, Mr. Speaker, I will not support this bill. It is a matter of confidence in this government, and I have none.
Question et commentaire, questions and comments. The honourable member for Brampton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask my honourable colleague, he talked a lot about the housing issue, but hasn't mentioned anything about how supply has decreased during COVID-19. He talked a lot about the government spending, but hasn't talked about why that spending was necessary, which I'd like to know, which of the benefits would the member had liked to have seen cut? Does he not agree with the business supports? Does he not agree with supporting seniors? There are measures in this bill as well to help curb the buying of homes, the residential properties as well. Does he not agree with that? The inflation is not just a problem here in Canada, but it is a global problem right now. And I would say that supply chain is the main reason for causing this problem. So if the member can give me his comments.
The honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
There's a lot there. I'll do the best I can with the time I have. To start with the last point, yes, indeed, there is inflation in other parts of the world, but no more so in no other advanced economy like there is in Canada. This is a Canadian phenomenon compared to our peer countries. On the housing, yes, indeed, supply is an issue, and we have seen nothing from this government to meaningfully address supply. Quite the opposite. We have a continuation of regulation, and then it goes to other levels of government as well. But certainly there are supply issues here. But what they've done is inflated the entire asset class with their deficits that are facilitated through the creation of new money. I did address that. And with respect to programs, yes, indeed, as we supported many of the support, we supported all of the support measures that were necessary to combat COVID. But as she might have noted in my speech, the parliamentary budget officers pointed out that the criteria for the stimulus portions here, their own rationale for them has disappeared, and yet the expenditures remain. And finally, I would like to thank her for participating in debate. It's nice to see somebody besides the member for Winnipeg North and the member for Kingston and the Islands actually doing their job and speaking in the House of Commons. Well done, thank you.
Tiens, et commentaires, questions and comments. L'honorable député de Rip.
The member for Repentigny. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our colleague from Calgary Rocky Ridge denounced the fact that there were no innovative policies on the part of the Liberal government. However, in last spring's budget, there were measures to crack down on tax evasion, but we haven't heard anything since then. There's nothing in C-8. So the hope this had given citizens and the trust Canadians should have in the Department of Finance are just not there. There's nothing to fight tax havens.
The member is absolutely right. This government has spent a lot of airtime during committee meetings and occasionally in the chamber paying lip service to the problems of money laundering in Canada, which is a very serious problem, and we really see it in the real estate industry. It's not a new phenomenon, but one that this government has failed to adequately address. I would agree with the member on that point.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de...
The honourable member for Montmagny. I'm sorry about the rest. Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask my colleague, I've just seen on Facebook, and somebody shared this with me, in my riding of Rivière-du-Loup, it's 166 per litre of gas. This is unprecedented in Canada. Super is at almost 190 a litre. The parliamentary budget officer, who my colleague referred to, so the PBO said the government has to stop spending. It's out of control. What does he think about that?
Well, I agree with him completely, and I know that in his riding, I'm sure that most people actually rely on personal vehicles for transportation to get to work and back. There's no subway system in that member's riding, and so the inflation impact, particularly on transportation, is a real problem for working people in Canada. And the PBO's concerns were well noted on the out of control spending.